It must have been something I ate last night. That's usually the first thought, when the number on the meter is higher first thing in the morning than it was at bedtime, before coffee, before breakfast, before anything has touched your plate yet. Your blood sugar really can run highest in the morning after 60, and for most people, it has almost nothing to do with dinner. It's a reasonable guess to blame the plate. It's also, for most people, the wrong one. Your liver runs on its own schedule, and it starts releasing sugar into your blood hours before you're even awake. By the end of this, you'll know why that happens, what it does and doesn't mean about your health, and the one thing about your evening that's actually worth changing, plus one thing you can stop worrying about entirely. Your liver clocks in before you do. Here's the part that doesn't add up at first. Your fasting number, the one you check before you've eaten anything, comes at the end of the longest stretch you go, all day without food. 7, 8, sometimes 10 hours with nothing coming in. If food were really running the show, that number should be your lowest of the day, not your highest. So something else is doing this, and it starts long before your alarm does. While you're asleep, your body is quietly getting ready to wake up. A handful of hormones start rising in the early morning hours: cortisol, growth hormone, glucagon, and adrenaline among them. Their job is to prepare you for the day ahead, and part of that job is telling your liver to release some of the sugar it's been storing, so you have fuel available the moment you're up and moving. That's true whether you ate a big dinner, a small one, or skipped it entirely. Here's the plain version of what's actually moving inside you. Your liver keeps a reserve of sugar on hand, called glycogen, built up gradually from meals earlier in the day, not just from whatever you had last night. In the hour or two before you wake, those rising hormones tell the liver to break some of that reserve back down into glucose and release it into your bloodstream, so your brain and muscles have fuel ready before you've eaten a single bite that morning. Your dinner plate isn't the source of that release. It was already sitting there, stored, days and meals in the making. This whole process tends to run roughly between 3 and 8 in the morning, which is why the number often looks worst right around the time most people actually check it, whenever their own particular first check happens to fall in that window. Doctors call this the dawn phenomenon. Research consistently shows roughly 3 out of 10 people with prediabetes or insulin resistance go through it, and among people who have diabetes, it's closer to 1 in 2. Picture it like your liver has its own alarm clock, set for the early morning, that goes off on its own schedule. Dinner doesn't set that alarm. It rings whether dinner happened or not. This tends to matter a little more after 60, for a second reason layered on top of the alarm clock itself. Clearing that morning glucose back out of your blood depends partly on how well your body responds to insulin, and several studies suggest that response can get somewhat less efficient with age, often tracking with changes in muscle and body fat more than with age by itself. So the exact same size release that a much younger body would clear quickly can sit in an older body's bloodstream a little longer and show up as a bigger, more stubborn number on the meter, even though nothing about the release itself was unusual. That's why the guess, "It must have been something I ate," so often misses. You're looking for the cause in the one thing you can see and remember. What was on your plate last night? When the bigger driver is something you can't see at all, a hormone signal that was already moving before you turned off the light, and a cleanup process that simply runs a little slower than it used to. There's a quieter piece to this too. Research tracking older adults' eating habits over time has found that, on average, both breakfast and dinner drift later as people age, and the whole daily eating window tends to shrink. The alarm clock inside you runs on its own schedule, and for a lot of people, the meals surrounding it are sliding later at the same time, leaving less of a gap between the last bite of the night and that early morning hormone rise than there used to be. Neither one is a mistake you made on purpose. They're just 2 separate shifts that happen to land in the same stretch of the night. Put those 2 pieces together, and the picture gets a lot less personal. It isn't that your body turned on you at 60. It's a scheduled hormone release. running on a timer that was never yours to set in the first place, meeting a cleanup system that, for most people, simply runs a little slower than it once did. That combination is common enough to have a name and a body of research behind it, which is a different thing entirely from something you did wrong. Your liver didn't wait for your fork. It never does. So if it's not dinner, and it's not something you did wrong, does that mean this happens to you the exact same way, every single night, like clockwork? Not exactly, and here's what this number actually does, and doesn't tell you. What this number doesn't mean. The first thing worth knowing is that the dawn phenomenon doesn't hit everyone the same way, or every night. Using the standard researchers use to count a real dawn rise, one large enough to actually matter, studies have found it in a little over half of people with diabetes, and less often in people with prediabetes or insulin resistance. It also isn't perfectly consistent from one night to the next in the same person. Some mornings the rise is bigger, some mornings it's barely there. Poor sleep and a stressful evening can both nudge the same hormones a little higher, which is one reason a rough night sometimes lines up with a rougher number the next morning, on top of whatever your dinner looked like. That's just how it varies. There's something else worth flagging here too. What this number probably isn't. There's another explanation you may have run into if you've spent any time researching this. Something called the Somogyi effect, where blood sugar drops too low overnight and the body overcorrects, leaving you with a high reading by morning. It sounds like a tidy explanation, almost the mirror image of the dawn phenomenon. Low first, then a rebound high, and it makes intuitive sense on paper. It's probably not what's happening to you though. It's a real pattern, but it's mostly seen in people taking insulin or certain other blood sugar medications. So if that isn't you, it's unlikely to be the explanation here at all. It's checked by testing blood sugar in the middle of the night, around 2 or 3 in the morning, with your doctor's guidance, not by guessing from a single morning number. It's not something to go start testing for on your own at 3 a.m., and newer research using continuous glucose monitors has actually found that people with high morning numbers more often ran high overnight too, not low, which has made doctors less quick to reach for that explanation than they used to be. In practice, for most people watching this, the plain dawn phenomenon is the far more likely story. None of this requires you to go buy a continuous glucose monitor or start tracking every reading to the minute to make sense of what's happening. That kind of device has its place for some people, under a doctor's direction, but understanding the pattern and having one honest change to make doesn't depend on owning one. A single high morning reading, on its own, isn't a reason to start adjusting a medication dose by yourself either. That decision belongs with whoever manages your prescriptions, working from a pattern over days or weeks, not one number. If you do want a sense of whether your own mornings run high often or rarely, the simple version is to notice the pattern over a week or two, rather than reacting to any one day. A single rough morning after a stressful evening or a bad night's sleep tells you very little on its own. A number that's consistently high, most mornings, regardless of what dinner looked like the night before, tells you something worth mentioning at your next appointment. The difference between those two is usually more useful than the exact number itself. If the cause is mostly a hormone signal you can't see or control, is there anything here that's actually yours to work with? There is. Just not the thing you've been blaming. The one lever that's actually yours. Here's something researchers noticed that's easy to miss. 2 people can eat close to the same dinner and wake up with 2 different numbers. A 2025 study following adults in their 50s, 60s, and 70s with prediabetes found that the later a meal was eaten, the harder it tended to be for the body to keep glucose steady overnight. And what shaped how much the number moved by morning was really 2 things together: what was in that last meal, and each person's own insulin sensitivity. In other words, timing matters, but so does the person it's landing on. Someone whose body still clears glucose efficiently might barely notice a late dinner. Someone whose clearing process has slowed down, which is more common after 60, is the person most likely to see it show up on the meter the next day. That's not a reason to feel singled out. It's closer to why some people can drink coffee at 9 at night and sleep fine, and others lie awake until midnight. Even so, timing by itself has shown a real, measurable effect. In a small trial, adults with type 2 diabetes who normally ate dinner after 10 at night were asked to shift the same dinner earlier, to before 8, without changing what they ate, their medication, their sleep, or their exercise. Nothing else changed. Just the clock. Their fasting glucose the next morning dropped, on average, from about 120 down to about 105. That's early evidence, from a small group, not seniors specifically, so it isn't a guarantee for everyone. But it's a real, measured example of the same lever you have available. Not what you eat, necessarily, but when the day's last real meal ends. Researchers are now setting up a more direct trial on exactly this question, timing a standard meal and watching what happens to the glucose response afterward. So this is an area that's actively getting more attention, not less. There's a second lever worth knowing, and it isn't about timing your plate at all. Working muscle pulls glucose out of your blood to burn as fuel, without needing as much insulin to do it, which is part of why a little movement right after eating has such an outsized effect. In a study of 10 adults 60 and older, a 15-minute walk after each meal lowered blood sugar over a full day, about as well as one longer 45-minute walk taken all at once. But it did something the long walk didn't. It cut the blood sugar rise specifically after the evening meal, for up to 3 hours afterward, more effectively than the sustained walk did. The researchers pointed out that dinner is usually the day's biggest meal, and the rise that follows it can stretch well into the night and into the next morning's reading. You don't need a gym session, special shoes, or a set distance. A short walk after you eat, even around the block or a few laps of the living room while the dishes wait, is the part with evidence specifically behind it. So, here's the practical part. What you eat at dinner still matters. But when your last real meal of the day ends matters too, and for a lot of people, it's the part nobody mentioned. Try giving your last meal some room before bed, rather than eating right up until you turn in. If you're usually asleep by 10, that might mean aiming to be finished eating by 7 or 8, instead of 8:30 or 9. Not a dramatic change, just a little more daylight between the last bite and the pillow. And if that last meal tends to be the biggest, carb-heaviest one of your day, that's a reasonable place to lighten the load slightly, or to follow it with a short walk, rather than assuming the whole day's eating needs an overhaul. None of this means treating dinner as something to fear or rush through. It's one thing you can actually change in a system that was mostly never about dinner to begin with. But before you touch anything about your evening routine, there's one group of people this doesn't apply to quite so simply. Anyone on insulin or a medication such as a sulfonylurea needs to treat evening meal changes differently, because shifting when or how you eat dinner can change how that medication behaves overnight, and an overnight low isn't something to risk finding out about the hard way. Nothing here is a substitute for the people who actually manage your prescriptions, and it was never meant to be. Bring your care team a week or two of morning readings rather than a single number, and let them decide whether your evening routine needs to shift. For everyone else, here's your one step. Tonight, when you finish your last meal of the day, take a short walk, even 10 or 15 minutes around the block or the living room, instead of heading straight to the couch, and try to have your fork down at least a couple of hours before you turn in, rather than eating right up until bed. Was your first instinct to blame dinner too, or did you already suspect it was something else? Tell us which one in the comments. We read every one. If a rule to remember isn't enough, and you'd rather have a written plan, the free action guide linked below spells out exactly how to time and build your evening meal. Next, we'll look at exactly what time you should be eating dinner after 60, and whether earlier is always better.